Officer, he can't stop. This man is in cardiac arrest.
I don't care what he's doing. I gave a lawful order.
Hey, wait.
Oh, my God.
Miller, stop saving him.
The rhythm was all that mattered. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. The heel of Jamal's right hand pressed into the sternum of the man on the ground. His left hand interlaced on top, his arms locked straight. The pressure was precise, a practiced and desperate piston driving life back into a body that had given up. The man, a stranger named Arthur Henderson, according to the panicked woman who had called 911, was pale, his skin clammy under the relentless afternoon sun of Liberty Park. His chest rose and fell not with his own breath, but with the force of Jamal's compressions. 30 compressions, then 2 quick breaths from the bag valve mask, his partner. Liam held in place. The cycle was a metronome counting down the seconds between life and irreversible brain death. Jamal was only 28, but his hands moved with the certainty of a man twice his age. 4 years on the ambulance had taught him that chaos had a sound, screaming, sirens, the crunch of metal, but saving a life was often a place of intense, focused silence. In this silence, the only sound was his own count, the squish of the ambu bag, and Liam's terse updates. No pulse, still V-fib, charging to 200, clear. Jamal pulled his hands back for a split second. The man's body arched unnaturally as the electricity shot through him. Without pause, Jamal was back on the chest, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. The rhythm was everything. It was the barrier against death. He was vaguely aware of the crowd forming a loose, nervous circle around them. He could feel their eyes, their morbid curiosity mixed with genuine fear. He blocked it all out. He blocked out the chirping of birds in the oak trees, the distant rumble of traffic on the boulevard, the heat radiating off the paved walkway. There was only the man beneath his hands and the unbreakable rhythm. That's why he didn't immediately register the shadow that fell over him. It wasn't until a voice cut through his concentration, sharp and laced with an authority that expected instant obedience, that the outside world intruded. "I need you to stop what you're doing." The voice was male, deep, and devoid of any questioning tone. It was a command. Jamal didn't look up. He couldn't. Breaking the rhythm for even a few seconds could cost the patient what little chance he had. His focus narrowed, his count becoming more deliberate. 21 and 22 and 23. "Hey, did you hear me? I'm talking to you. I need to ask you some questions." Jamal's mind raced. Police. He knew the tone. He'd worked with dozens of cops at hundreds of scenes. Some were partners, professionals who understood the hierarchy of an emergency. Medical calls were medical lead. Fire calls were fire lead. Crime scenes were police lead. This was not a crime scene. This was a man dying. With his left hand still guiding the compressions, he raised his right hand just for a second, a quick, universally understood gesture. "One moment. I cannot stop." He didn't make eye contact. He couldn't afford the distraction. The patient's life was literally in his hands. "Are you ignoring me?" The voice was closer now, laced with indignation. "I'm a police officer. I gave you a lawful order. Stand up and step away from him." Liam, sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere, looked up from the airway bag. "Officer, he can't stop," Liam said, his own voice tight with stress. "This man is in cardiac arrest. He's performing CPR." The officer, a white man in his mid-30s with a hard-set jaw and a nameplate that read Miller, took another step closer. His hand rested on his belt, near his service weapon. His eyes weren't on the dying man. They were locked on Jamal, on the back of his dark blue uniform, on the focused, methodical movement that he had just decided was an act of defiance. I don't care what he's doing. This is an active scene, and I need to secure it. When I give an order, you follow it. That's the law. Jamal finished his cycle of 30 and gave Liam a nod. Liam delivered 2 breaths. The man's chest rose and fell. Then Jamal was back on the chest, the rhythm unbroken. He could feel the officer's anger radiating like heat off the pavement. He was choosing his patient over a policeman's ego, and he knew, even in his state of extreme focus, that this choice was about to have consequences. But it wasn't a choice at all. It was his duty. It was his oath. The man on the ground deserved a fighting chance, and that chance was measured in compressions per minute, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. He would not stop. He could not stop. That's it! Miller's voice was a low growl. You're obstructing! Jamal felt a hand clamp down on his shoulder, hard and strong. The grip was meant to pull him, to break the rhythm by force. Don't touch me, Jamal said, his voice a strained grunt, the first words he'd spoken to the officer. I'm saving a man's life. The hand tightened, fingers digging into his shoulder muscle. The unbreakable rhythm was about to be shattered. The world, which had been compressed into the space of a man's chest, exploded into chaos. Officer Miller's grip was not a suggestion. It was a physical statement of power. He yanked Jamal backward, his strength fueled by a surge of adrenaline and indignation. The motion was jarring, violent. For a split second, Jamal's hands lifted from the patient's sternum. The rhythm, the steady life-sustaining beat he had maintained against all odds, was broken. The metronome fell silent. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, a sound of shock and disbelief. What are you doing? Liam yelled, his face a mask of incredulous fury. He scrambled to take over, clumsily finding his position over the patient and starting his own compressions. But his rhythm was frantic, less precise, his focus shattered by the officer's aggression. He was in the middle of a cycle. You can't just stop CPR. Miller ignored him. His entire attention was a laser beam fixed on Jamal, who now stood, forced upright by the officer's grip. I gave you a lawful command, Miller said, his voice rising, justifying his actions to the crowd of stunned faces and recording cell phones. This is a police matter. You refuse to comply? That's obstruction of justice. Jamal stared at the officer, his mind struggling to reconcile the reality of the situation. He was a paramedic, in uniform, performing the most critical medical intervention possible, and he was being treated like a criminal. My patient is dying, Jamal said, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the officer's escalating volume. He needs continuous chest compressions. What you just did could kill him. Miller's face flushed a deep red. In his world, the one defined by the badge on his chest and the gun on his hip, authority was a one-way street. A black man in a paramedic's uniform telling him he was wrong was not something his pride could absorb. It was fuel on a fire he had already decided to light. You should have thought of that before you decided to resist, Miller snarled. He spun Jamal around with a practiced, brutal efficiency, forcing his arms behind his back. The cold, metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists was unnervingly loud in the sudden quiet. The onlookers, who had been murmuring in shock, now fell silent, their phones held high, capturing every moment of the unbelievable scene. A paramedic, who seconds earlier had been fighting to save a man's life, was now in custody for doing his job. You are under arrest for obstruction and resisting an officer, Miller recited, his voice formal now, as if reading from a script he'd memorized to justify any action. Jamal felt a wave of nausea. He looked over Miller's shoulder at his patient. Liam was doing his best, but he was alone. He was trying to manage compressions, watch the monitor, and handle the airway. It was a two-person job, a job that was now being done by one, because a police officer had demanded to ask questions. "My patient," Jamal said again, the words catching in his throat. The plea wasn't for himself. It was for Arthur Henderson, the man whose heart had stopped and whose fate now rested on a partner working under impossible stress. "You need to let me go. You are interfering with emergency medical treatment. That is against the law." Miller pushed him toward the patrol car parked haphazardly on the grass, its lights now flashing, bathing the surreal scene in strobes of red and blue. "You can tell it to the judge," Miller said, his voice dripping with condescending finality. He didn't look back at the man on the ground, the epicenter of the emergency he had just derailed. He didn't seem to care that the lifeline, the fragile, rhythmic thread connecting a man to his own life, had been severed not by a failing heart, but by his own two hands. The crowd began to find its voice. Shouts of, "He was helping him," and "What's wrong with you?" cut through the air. A construction worker from a nearby site, a large man with a tool belt slung over his hips, took a step forward. "Hey, man, that ain't right. He's a paramedic." Miller turned, his hand dropping instinctively to his sidearm. "Get back! All of you, get back! This is a police scene now!" The threat was clear. He had established control, and the cost of that control was a man's chance at survival, now bleeding away with every missed compression and every second of delayed defibrillation. Jamal felt the hard plastic of the patrol car's back seat against his cheek as Miller pushed him inside. The door slammed shut, sealing him in a cage of his own helplessness. The world became a silent movie viewed through a mesh cage and thick plexiglass. The sounds of the park, Liam's desperate counts, the shouts from the crowd, the approaching wail of a second ambulance, were muffled, distant, as if coming from underwater. From the back of Officer Miller's patrol car, Jamal could only watch. His wrists burned from the tightness of the handcuffs. A deep, cold dread pooled in his stomach. A feeling worse than fear. It was impotence. He was a healer, a trained professional whose entire purpose was to act, and he was trapped, forced to be a spectator at the potential death he had been fighting to prevent. He watched Liam, his partner, his friend, work with a frantic energy. Liam was good, but the task was overwhelming. He was trying to keep the CPR rhythm while glancing at the cardiac monitor, preparing another shock, ensuring the airway stayed open every few seconds. He'd look over toward the patrol car, his expression a mixture of fury and desperation. Their eyes met through the glass, and Jamal could only give a slight, helpless shake of his head. "Stay on him. Liam, don't worry about me. Stay on him." Officer Miller stood outside the car, his back to Jamal, speaking into his shoulder radio. His posture was rigid, defensive. He was crafting his narrative, turning a medical emergency he had catastrophically mishandled into a story of a non-compliant suspect and an officer maintaining order. Jamal knew the playbook. The report would be sterile, official. It would mention a refusal to obey lawful orders and creating a safety issue. It would omit the detail that those orders had involved stopping life-saving medical care. The second ambulance, Engine 22, screamed to a halt. Two new paramedics, a woman named Sarah and a man Jamal recognized as Mike, jumped out, their faces set in grim determination. They ran to the scene, their medical bags slapping against their thighs. Sarah immediately dropped to her knees and took over compressions from an exhausted Liam, her movements smooth and powerful, instantly restoring a proper rhythm. Mike began setting up a new IV line. Liam, breathless and sweating, pointed a shaking finger toward Miller's patrol car, explaining the situation in short. Angry bursts. Sarah's head snapped up. She stared at the patrol car, her eyes widening in disbelief as she saw Jamal sitting in the back, handcuffed, The look on her face confirmed everything. This was insane. This was a nightmare none of them had ever trained for. Under the care of a full, fresh team, Mr. Henderson's chances ticked upward again. They loaded him onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency. As they carried him toward their ambulance, Sarah continued to glance back, her expression hardening from confusion to anger. She knew Jamal. They'd come up through the academy around the same time. She knew his reputation, calm, competent, unshakable. Seeing him in handcuffs was like seeing the sky turn green. It didn't make sense. The ambulance doors slammed shut. With a final piercing siren blast, it pulled away, lights painting the trees in frantic strokes of red and white before it disappeared onto the main road, taking with it the man Jamal had sworn to protect. Silence descended on the small patch of grass. The crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves, shaking their heads. Liam walked over to the patrol car, his face pale with rage. He stood a few feet from Miller, who was now leaning against his car, writing in a small notepad. "You nearly killed him. You know that?" Liam's voice was low, shaking with contained fury. "The interruption. Minutes without proper CPR. If he doesn't make it, that's on you." Miller didn't look up from his notepad. "Your partner was obstructing a police investigation. It's that simple. He chose to escalate." "What investigation?" Liam's voice cracked. "A man had a heart attack. You were the only one escalating. I'm reporting this. My supervisor, the medical director, everyone is going to hear about this." Miller finally looked up, his eyes cold and flat. "You do that. File any report you want." He looked at Liam's uniform as if it were a costume. "Just remember who's in charge at these scenes." He finally opened Jamal's door and climbed into the driver's seat. The car dipping with his weight, he started the engine, the air conditioning blasting on, a sterile hum in the charged silence. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting Jamal's in the reflection before flicking away. He hadn't said a word to Jamal since putting him in the car, for the first time, locked in the suffocating quiet of the back seat. The full weight of his own powerlessness crashed down on Jamal. He had done everything right, followed every protocol, and his reward was a cage with a view of his own failure. The drive to the downtown precinct was a 12-minute exercise in strained silence. Officer Miller drove with a rigid focus, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was either replaying the events in his head, building the walls of his justification higher, or he was trying not to think about them at all. Jamal leaned his head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city slide by in a blur. Each passing building felt like a stone, weighing him down, pulling him further away from the world where he made sense, the world of sirens, patience, and saving lives, and deeper into a bureaucratic labyrinth where his uniform meant nothing. He had been in this precinct building dozens of times, but always through the front doors, walking alongside a patient on a gurney or dropping off a report to an officer after a call. Today, he came through the sally port, the rear entrance reserved for suspects. The heavy steel door buzzed open and clanged shut behind them, the sound echoing the finality of his situation. Miller led him through a series of gray, sterile hallways, his hand firmly on Jamal's elbow. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, disinfectant, and a faint, underlying metallic tang of anxiety. Heads turned as they entered the main booking area. Cops looked up from their computers, their conversations momentarily halting. A paramedic in uniform, in handcuffs, was not a common sight. It was a disruption to the natural order of things, and the curiosity in the room was palpable. Miller walked him toward the booking desk with an air of defiant purpose, as if daring anyone to question him. Behind the high counter sat Sergeant Frank Donovan, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face, a thick mustache, and the weary eyes of someone who had seen every possible permutation of human folly. Donovan had been on the job for 30 years. He knew every paramedic, firefighter, and beat cop in the city. He looked at Jamal, then at Miller, and his expression shifted from neutral boredom to sharp attention. "Miller, what in God's name is this?" Donovan asked, his voice a low rumble that carried easily across the room. He nodded toward Jamal. "That's Jamal Fisher. He's one of the best medics we've got." "What's he doing in cuffs?" Miller's jaw tightened. He had clearly expected to process his arrest without commentary from a senior officer. "He's under arrest. Sergeant, obstruction of a governmental operation and resisting." Donovan leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the counter. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture of profound weariness. "Obstruction? Resisting? He was on a call, wasn't he? I heard the cardiac arrest dispatch for Liberty Park come over the radio not 20 minutes ago." "That's the scene, Sarge," Miller said. His voice clipped. "He refused to obey my lawful orders to secure the area." Donovan stared at Miller, his gaze unwavering. He had seen young, hot-headed cops like Miller before, officers who saw the badge as a crown, who confused compliance with respect and viewed any hesitation as a challenge. "Secure the area, or secure your ego," Donovan muttered, just loud enough for Miller to hear. He then looked at Jamal, a hint of apology in his eyes. "What happened, son?" Before Jamal could answer, Miller cut in. "Sergeant, with all due respect, I am the arresting officer. He can make his statement later." Donovan's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push. He knew the procedural lines, and Miller, for now, was standing on the right side of them. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. Donovan picked up his pen and began the slow, methodical process of booking. He started with Jamal's belongings, his wallet, which contained his paramedic certifications and state license, his phone, the trauma shears clipped to his belt. As Donovan laid out the items, he paused on the worn leather wallet. He opened it and stared at the ID and the rows of medical certifications behind it. Paramedic, Advanced Cardiac Life Support, Pediatric Advanced Life Support, Pre-Hospital Trauma Life Support, a man dedicated to saving lives. "What was the investigation you were conducting, Miller?" Donovan asked, not looking up from his paperwork. His tone was casual, but the question was anything but. "It was a public medical emergency. I needed to ascertain if there was any foul play. And to do that, you needed the paramedic performing chest compressions to stop?" Donovan's pen scratched across the form. The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusation. Miller didn't answer. Other officers in the room were now listening intently, pretending to work. They knew what Donovan was doing. He was building a record, creating a series of questions and non-answers that would be noted, officially or unofficially. The whispers had started. The story of the hot-headed cop who arrested a paramedic mid-call was already beginning its journey through the precinct's bloodstream. Miller may have won the battle in the park, but in the court of professional opinion, right here in his own house, he was already losing the war. The holding cell was cold. Jamal sat on the unforgiving metal bench, the chill seeping through his uniform pants. The door had slammed shut with a deafening clang, a sound of institutional indifference. Through the small barred window in the door, he could see the mundane activity of the precinct continue. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, officers laughed at a shared joke. It felt like another dimension. His world had been reduced to a 6-by-8-foot concrete box. He replayed the events over and over, each time his mind snagging on the same point of disbelief. He was arrested for doing his job. He had followed years of training, followed a protocol written in the blood and experience of countless paramedics before him. Do no harm. The patient comes first. Do not stop compressions. These weren't suggestions. They were commandments. And for following them, he was here. He thought about Mr. Henderson. Was he alive? Was he in surgery? Or was he already gone? His death certificate indirectly co-signed by Officer Miller. The not knowing was a physical ache, a knot of acid in his gut. He had been in the cell for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than an hour when he saw a new figure approaching. She was a woman in her late 40s, dressed in a sharp, dark gray pantsuit. She walked with a speed and purpose that made the officers in her path instinctively step aside. She carried a leather briefcase in one hand and an air of absolute, non-negotiable competence. She stopped in front of his cell and looked at the officer standing guard. "I'm Eleanor Vance," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "I'm here for my client, Mr. Jamal Fisher. Open the door." The guard looked momentarily flustered. Glancing toward Sergeant Donovan at the booking desk, Donovan gave a subtle nod. The cavalry had arrived. The cell door swung open. The woman, Eleanor Vance, stepped just inside and extended a hand. "Mr. Fisher, I'm Eleanor Vance. Your union president called my office the second he got off the phone with your partner. I want you to know you are not alone in this." Jamal stood and shook her hand. Her grip was firm, reassuring. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice hoarse. "Do you know anything about my patient?" Her expression softened for a fraction of a second. "Your partner said he had a pulse back when he reached the hospital, but it was touch and go. That's all we know right now. Our first priority is getting you out of here. Our second is making sure Officer Miller's career is over. Our third is to ensure the city pays for what happened today." She led him out of the cell to a small, private interview room. The moment the door closed, her demeanor became all business. She pulled a legal pad from her briefcase. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the moment you arrived on scene. Do not leave out a single detail. What you said, what he said, what your partner said, who was watching. Everything." Jamal recounted the story, his training for detailed medical reports serving him well. He described the patient's condition, the rhythm of his compressions, the officer's initial approach, the hand gesture, the escalation, the physical removal, the handcuffs, the words exchanged. Vance listened intently, her pen flying across the page, her eyes never leaving his. She would occasionally interject with a sharp, clarifying question. Did he identify what crime he was investigating? No. Did he ever ask if you or your partner needed assistance? No. Did he read you your Miranda rights at any point? Jamal paused. No. He didn't. Vance underlined a sentence on her pad with a vicious slash of her pen. Good. That's very good. She looked up at him, her eyes sharp and analytical. Jamal, what happened to you today was not just wrong. It was illegal on multiple levels. He interfered with emergency medical services, which is a felony in this state. He arrested you without probable cause. He failed to read you your rights. This isn't just a complaint. This is a federal civil rights lawsuit waiting to be filed. She exuded a confidence that was more than just reassuring. It was contagious. For the first time since the hand clamped down on his shoulder, Jamal felt a flicker of something other than dread. It was a spark of fight. He nearly killed that man, Ms. Vance, Jamal said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. That's what this is about. He valued his authority more than a human life. Eleanor Vance closed her notepad and leaned forward. I know. And that is exactly what we are going to prove to a jury. They've picked a fight with the wrong paramedic. And with the wrong lawyer. She stood up. I'm going to go post your bail, which the never should have said in the first place. Your partner is waiting for you outside. Don't talk to any police officers. Don't talk to the media. From now on, you talk only to me. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Jamal said. The battle had shifted. It was no longer about a patch of grass in Liberty Park. It was about courtrooms, depositions, and the slow, grinding machinery of justice. And for the first time, Jamal felt like he wasn't fighting it alone. The click of the precinct's front door closing behind him was the sound of a chapter ending. The late afternoon sunlight was warm on his face, a stark contrast to the refrigerated air of the station. Leaning against the side of their ambulance, looking exhausted and profoundly worried, was Liam. He straightened up the moment he saw Jamal, his relief visible. He rushed forward and pulled Jamal into a brief, hard hug. Man, I'm so sorry. I tried to stop him. You did everything you could, Liam, Jamal said, cutting him off. You stayed with the patient. That's what mattered. How is he? Do you know anything? Liam's face, which had been bright with relief, clouded over. The grim reality of the situation returned. I just got off the phone with Sarah. They got him to Memorial. He's alive. A wave of relief washed over Jamal so intensely he felt his knees weaken. Alive. Thank God. But Liam wasn't finished. His expression was grim. He's alive, but it's not good. Jamal. He coded again in the ambulance. They worked on him for another 20 minutes in the ER before they got him stabilized. The doctor said the delay, the time without effective CPR, it caused a severe anoxic brain injury. The words hit Jamal like a physical blow. Anoxic brain injury. Lack of oxygen to the brain. It was the one outcome every paramedic dreaded. The ghost that haunted every cardiac arrest call. It meant the heart might be beating, but the person, the consciousness, the memories, the personality, might be gone forever. How severe? Jamal asked, his voice barely a whisper. The ER doc said it's bad. They don't know the extent of the damage yet. He's in a coma. In the ICU. They're doing what they can. But Sarah said the prognosis is guarded. Guarded. The clinical, detached word for hopeless. Jamal felt the earlier spark of fight dwindle, replaced by a profound, soul-crushing sadness. This was no longer about a wrongful arrest or a bruised ego. This was about a life that had been irrevocably shattered. Mr. Arthur Henderson, the retired librarian, the grandfather, had been pulled back from the brink of death only to be left in a permanent twilight. And it had happened because Officer Miller needed to ask questions. The price of that interruption was now terrifyingly clear. It was the cost of a man's mind. Eleanor Vance walked up behind them, her heels clicking on the pavement. She had overheard the end of their conversation. This changes everything, she said, her voice devoid of its earlier triumphant fire, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This is no longer just a civil rights case about your arrest, Jamal. This is about what that officer did to Mr. Henderson. The patient's outcome is now the central pillar of our lawsuit. Every minute of that delay will be scrutinized. Every medical expert we hire will testify about what those lost seconds of blood flow to the brain really mean. Jamal looked at his hands. These hands had been working. They had been doing what they were trained to do. They had been trying to hold the line, and they had been pulled away. The guilt, irrational as it was, began to creep in. I don't know. I should have done something different. Liam put a hand on his shoulder. There was nothing else you could do. Man, you were doing the job. You can't stop CPR, period. Any medic in the world would have done the same thing. Vance nodded in agreement. Liam is right. Your actions were medically and ethically correct. His were not. That's the entire case. And now, the damages aren't just about your false imprisonment for a few hours. They are about a lifetime of care for Mr. Henderson. They are about what was stolen from him and his family. She looked from Jamal to Liam, her gaze unflinching. The city is going to try and make this about you, Jamal. They will say you were insubordinate, that you were unprofessional. Our job is to make sure that every time they say your name. The jury pictures Arthur Henderson lying in a hospital bed. This fight just got bigger. It's a crusade now. Not just for you, but for him. Jamal looked up at the towering glass and steel of the city's skyscrapers. Somewhere in one of those buildings, a family was getting the worst news of their lives. A wife, children, grandchildren were being told that the man they loved might never wake up. All because one officer, on one sunny afternoon, decided the rhythm of his authority was more important than the rhythm of a human heart. The crusade had begun. The lawsuit was filed in federal court 3 days later. The language of the complaint, drafted with surgical precision by Eleanor Vance and her team, was cold, factual, and utterly devastating. Jamal Fisher and the estate of Arthur Henderson versus Officer Nathan Miller and the city of St. Corbin. It detailed the events in minute-by-minute increments, using dispatch logs, ambulance timers, and Liam's official report as its foundation. It cited specific state and federal laws that had been violated: interference with emergency medical services, unlawful arrest under the Fourth Amendment, and a violation of Jamal's civil rights under color of law. But the emotional core of the document lay in the pages detailing the medical consequences for Arthur Henderson. It included a preliminary report from a neurologist outlining the profound and likely permanent brain damage caused by the prolonged hypoxia during the critical minutes when CPR was interrupted. The filing landed like a grenade in the city attorney's office. It was immediately leaked to the press, and the story, which had been a local curiosity, exploded into a national headline. The cell phone videos taken by bystanders in the park went viral. The footage was grainy but clear: a paramedic working desperately on a man's chest, a police officer's aggressive intervention, the shocking moment of the arrest. The court of public opinion was convening, and its initial verdict was overwhelmingly against Officer Miller and the department. The city, sensing a public relations and legal catastrophe, moved faster than anyone expected, less than 48 hours after the suit was filed. Eleanor Vance received a call from the lead city attorney, a man named Marcus Thorne. He was known as a pragmatist, a fixer who prioritized damage control over protracted legal battles. "Eleanor, let's cut to the chase," Thorne said, his voice smooth and conciliatory. "This situation is regrettable. It was a tragic misunderstanding on a chaotic scene. My client, the city, is prepared to make a significant settlement offer to make this right. For both your clients, we can have this resolved and put behind us by the end of the week." Vance listened, saying nothing, letting the silence hang on the line. She knew what this was. It was a panic move. They wanted to stanch the bleeding, to kill the story before it could metastasize. "What kind of significant are we talking about, Marcus?" she asked, her tone neutral. $750,000, Thorne said. "Split between Mr. Fisher and the Henderson family. It's a strong, good faith offer, no admission of wrongdoing, of course, but it's a substantial amount to avoid litigation." Vance almost laughed. It was a classic lowball, disguised as a generous offer. It was nuisance value, designed to sound like a lot of money to ordinary people while being a rounding error in the city's budget. It was money to buy silence. She scheduled a meeting with Jamal and the Henderson family that afternoon. She sat with them in her conference room, Jamal in his civilian clothes, looking tired but resolute, and Arthur Henderson's wife, Carol, and their adult son, David, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion. She laid out the offer calmly and professionally. The city is offering $750,000 to settle this case immediately. This would mean no trial, no discovery, no depositions. It would be over. David Henderson, a high school history teacher with his father's kind eyes, spoke first. My father is lying in a long-term care facility. The doctors say he may never wake up. If he does, he will need 24-hour medical care for the rest of his life. $750,000. That wouldn't even cover 2 years of his medical bills. Is that what they think his life is worth? His voice was quiet, but it trembled with a rage that was deeper than any shout. Carol Henderson, a woman who had been married to her husband for 42 years, simply shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. It's not about the money, Ms. Vance. That officer, he needs to be held accountable. People need to know what he did. If we take this money, he'll still have his job. The city will say it was a misunderstanding. Nothing will change. What happens to the next person? The next paramedic who's just trying to do their job? All eyes turned to Jamal. He looked at the Henderson family, at their pain, and his own resolve hardened into steel. He had wrestled with what this fight was about, his arrest, his reputation. But sitting here, looking at the wreckage of this family's life, he knew with absolute clarity what it was for. My answer is no, Jamal said, his voice firm. This isn't about a paycheck. It's about making sure no other family has to sit in a room like this because an officer couldn't wait 5 minutes. We are not settling. Not for this. Vance looked at each of them and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was the answer she had expected, the answer she had hoped for. That's what I told them you'd say, she said, a faint smile touching her lips. She picked up her phone. I'll call Marcus Thorne and deliver the message. When she got Thorne on the line, her voice was cool and formal. Marcus, we've considered your offer. The answer is a resounding no. We will see you in discovery. We are going to depose Officer Miller. We are going to get his body camera footage, his service record, and every complaint ever filed against him. We are going to build a case that proves exactly what happened, and we are going to let a jury decide what justice looks like. She hung up the phone. The first salvo had been fired and returned. The battle lines were drawn. There would be no easy way out for the city. There would be a reckoning. The discovery phase of a lawsuit is where the real war is fought, far from the public eye of the courtroom. It's a slow, methodical grind of paperwork, document requests, and legal maneuvering. For Eleanor Vance and her team, the first target was singular and obvious: Officer Nathan Miller's complete service record. The city's attorneys fought back, as expected. They filed motions to limit the scope of the request, arguing that Miller's past performance was irrelevant to the incident in the park. They claimed it was a fishing expedition designed to harass a decorated officer. When they fight this hard to hide something, Vance told Jamal during a strategy meeting, it's because there's something worth finding. She filed a counter-motion, arguing that an officer's history of conduct, especially regarding use of force and citizen complaints, was directly relevant to proving a pattern of behavior and a failure of departmental oversight. The judge, a no-nonsense former prosecutor named Maria Sandoval, agreed with Vance. She ordered the city to produce the complete, unredacted file. When the file arrived, a thick 9-inch binder delivered by a grim-faced city courier, it was a revelation. Nathan Miller had been with the Street Corbin Police Department for 6 years. Before that, he'd spent 4 years as a military police officer. On paper, his record looked adequate, with regular commendations for arrests. But threaded throughout the official praise was a darker, more troubling narrative. In his 6 years on the force, 31 citizen complaints had been filed against him. The average for an officer in his district with similar tenure was 4. Vance and her paralegals spent days poring over every page, cross-referencing dates and incident reports. A pattern began to emerge, as clear as a line drawn in the sand. The complaints were overwhelmingly for excessive force, abuse of authority, and unlawful detention during seemingly low-level encounters, traffic stops, noise complaints, minor disputes. A college student accused Miller of slamming him against his car for talking back when he asked why he was being pulled over. A woman filed a complaint stating Miller had illegally searched her purse during a stop for jaywalking. A shop owner claimed Miller had threatened him with arrest for questioning his aggressive treatment of a homeless man outside his store. In every case, the narrative was the same. A citizen had questioned Miller's authority or failed to comply with his commands with what he deemed sufficient speed, and he had responded with immediate escalation. He didn't de-escalate, he dominated. The most damning part was not the complaints themselves, but the disposition of each one. Of the 31 complaints, 30 had been dismissed by Internal Affairs as unfounded or unsubstantiated. The one that was sustained resulted in a written reprimand, a slap on the wrist for an incident where he had broken a suspect's arm during an arrest for arguing. "This is it," Vance said, tapping a stack of complaint forms. "This is the heart of our case against the city. This isn't about one officer having a bad day. This is about a department that knew they had a problem officer and did nothing. They saw the red flags. They saw the pattern of aggression, the inability to handle any challenge to his authority. They ignored it. They dismissed it. They covered it up. They are just as responsible for what happened to Arthur Henderson as Miller is. They loaded the gun and handed it to him. The file gave them names and contact information for every person who had filed a complaint. Vance's team began reaching out. Many were reluctant to talk, fearful of police retaliation. But some agreed. They found a former EMT who had filed a complaint 2 years earlier. Miller had interfered with his treatment of a car crash victim, demanding he move his ambulance because it was blocking a potential crime scene when there was no crime. The EMT had refused, and Miller had threatened him with arrest until a sergeant arrived and de-escalated the situation. The complaint had been dismissed as a personality conflict. Another witness, a young lawyer Miller had pulled over, described the officer's demeanor. "It was like he was looking for a fight," the lawyer said over the phone. "I asked him why he needed me out of the car for a broken taillight, and his entire demeanor changed. His eyes went cold. He said, 'Because I'm the one with the badge.' It wasn't about the law. It was about him being in charge." The picture was now crystal clear. Officer Miller was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a time bomb of ego and aggression. The city had been repeatedly warned, not by statistics or abstract reports, but by its own citizens, and they had done nothing. The incident in Liberty Park wasn't an anomaly, it was an inevitability. Vance knew that when she presented this pattern to a jury, they wouldn't just see one paramedic's wrongful arrest. They would see a system that had protected a bully in a badge, a system that had failed its duty to the public long before Jamal ever started chest compressions on Arthur Henderson. If the service record was the map of Officer Miller's history, his body camera footage was a guided tour of his mindset on the day of the incident. The city fought its release even harder than they fought the release of his file. They claimed it was part of an ongoing internal investigation, and that releasing it would compromise that process. Eleanor Vance countered that the footage was primary evidence in a federal lawsuit and that withholding it was an act of obstruction. Once again, Judge Sandoval sided with Vance, ordering the immediate release of the unedited footage. Vance, Jamal, and her legal team gathered in a conference room to watch it for the first time. The video file was loaded onto a large monitor at the front of the room. "Are you ready for this, Jamal?" Vance asked gently. He nodded, his jaw set. He needed to see it. He needed to understand what had happened from the other side. The video began with a shaky view of the patrol car's dashboard as Miller drove. He was listening to the radio, his breathing calm. The dispatch call came in. "Citizen report of a male down. Possible cardiac arrest. Liberty Park, west entrance, EMS is en route." The video showed Miller acknowledging the call and turning the car toward the park. There was no sense of urgency in his driving, no sirens. He arrived on the scene several minutes after Jamal and Liam. The camera's perspective shifted as he got out of the car. He walked slowly toward the small crowd, his gait confident, almost casual. The unblinking eye of the camera captured the scene exactly as Jamal remembered it. He and Liam working on Mr. Henderson, a small circle of worried onlookers. But the audio revealed Miller's internal state. Before he even reached the scene, he spoke into his radio. "Got a crowd forming. Gonna need to secure this scene." He had already framed the situation not as a medical emergency to be assisted, but as a crowd to be controlled. He approached Jamal from behind. The camera showed the back of Jamal's uniform, his arms moving in the steady, powerful rhythm of CPR. Then came Miller's voice, clear and demanding on the recording. "I need you to stop what you're doing." The camera captured Jamal's brief hand gesture, the clear, non-confrontational signal to wait. The audio then picked up Miller's own breathing, a short, sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone taking offense. "Are you ignoring me?" he said, his voice instantly harder. The camera moved closer, looming over Jamal. It recorded Liam's desperate plea. "Officer, he can't stop. This man is in cardiac arrest." And then came the most damning moment. Miller's response, recorded in crystal-clear audio. "I don't care what he's doing. This is an active scene, and I need to secure it." The camera lurched as he reached out and grabbed Jamal's shoulder. It captured the exact moment the CPR stopped. The video showed Liam scrambling to take over, the chaos and confusion among the bystanders. It then whipped around as Miller spun Jamal, the world becoming a blur of motion before focusing on Jamal's face, a mask of disbelief and concern for his patient. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was sharp and loud. The footage continued for another 20 minutes. It showed Miller's condescending dismissal of Liam's protests. It showed him threatening the crowd. It showed the arrival of the second ambulance crew and their shocked expressions. Most importantly, it showed Miller's complete and utter disregard for the man dying just a few feet away. Not once in the entire video did the camera pan down to check on Arthur Henderson. Not once did Miller ask about his condition. His focus was singular. The paramedic who had dared to defy him. When the video ended, the conference room was silent. Jamal stared at the blank screen, his face pale. He had lived it, but seeing it from Miller's perspective was profoundly disturbing. It was a first-hand view of a man whose ego was so fragile that a paramedic's focused silence was perceived as a threat worthy of a violent response. "Well," Eleanor Vance said, her voice a low, controlled fury. "He just became our star witness." She turned to her team. "I want that video synced with the dispatch logs. I want a timeline down to the second, from the moment CPR stopped to the moment the second crew resumed it. I want a medical expert to watch this and explain, frame by frame, what the lack of oxygen was doing to Mr. Henderson's brain during that entire gap." The body camera, a tool intended to provide police accountability, had done its job perfectly. It had not exonerated the officer. It had crucified him. It was an objective, unblinking record of his catastrophic failure in judgment. And Vance knew, with chilling certainty, that it was the piece of evidence that would win them the case. A jury would not just hear about what happened, they would see it, and seeing, in this case, would be believing. The deposition of Officer Nathan Miller took place in a sterile conference room at a neutral law firm. It was a gray, overcast day, the weather matching the somber mood of the proceedings. Miller arrived flanked by 2 city attorneys and a representative from his police union. He wore a crisp suit, his hair neatly cut, a stark contrast to the uniformed officer on the body cam footage. He carried himself with an air of defiant confidence, as if this were a mere formality, an inconvenience to be endured before he was inevitably cleared. Jamal was there, sitting beside Eleanor Vance. His presence was a strategic choice. Vance wanted Miller to see the man whose life he had upended. She wanted him to be forced to answer for his actions while looking his victim in the eye. The deposition began, as they always do, with simple background questions. Name, rank, years of service. Miller's answers were short, clipped, and confident. Then Vance began to circle closer to the incident itself. Her tone was calm, almost conversational, but her questions were scalpels. Officer Miller, could you please describe your understanding of the role of a paramedic at a medical emergency? She began. They provide medical aid, Miller said simply. And what is your role when you arrive at such a scene? To secure the scene, ensure the safety of the public and the first responders, and to investigate any potential criminal activity. On that day, what criminal activity did you suspect was taking place? Vance asked, her eyes fixed on him. Miller hesitated for a moment. I didn't know. A man was down in a public place. It could have been anything. An assault, a poisoning, an overdose. I had to investigate. And to investigate, Vance continued, you believed it was necessary for the paramedic performing life-saving chest compressions to stop immediately? The city attorney cleared his throat. Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence. It's on the video. Counsel. Vance shot back without looking at him. Please answer the question. Officer. I needed his attention, Miller said, his voice hardening. He was ignoring a lawful command. That is Officer Safety 101. You cannot have people on a scene ignoring direct orders. Vance leaned forward slightly. So, your personal safety felt threatened by a paramedic who was on his knees, with both hands occupied. Saving a man's life? My authority was being challenged. Miller corrected her. If one person can ignore me, others will, and the scene can devolve into chaos. I needed to establish control. There it was. The admission Vance had been waiting for. It was never about a crime, or safety, or even an investigation. It was about control. Vance then had the body camera footage played on a large monitor in the room. She paused it at key moments. Officer Miller, at this moment, you can see my client gesture for you to wait. Did you interpret that as a sign of aggression? I interpreted it as a sign of non-compliance. At this moment, she continued, pausing the video again, you can hear his partner, Paramedic O'Malley, telling you that the patient is in cardiac arrest and that Mr. Fisher cannot stop. Did you have any reason to disbelieve him? Things happen fast on a scene. I had to make a judgment call. And your judgment was that your need to ask questions was more urgent than the patient's need for continuous blood flow to his brain? Objection! Calls for a medical conclusion. The city attorney interjected. I'll rephrase, Vance said smoothly. Did you have any medical training that would lead you to believe that stopping chest compressions on a cardiac arrest patient was a medically sound decision? A long silence filled the room. I am not a paramedic, Miller finally said through clenched teeth. No, Vance said, her voice dropping to an almost whisper. You are not. Yet you made a medical decision for Mr. Henderson that day, didn't you? A decision his doctors say has left him with catastrophic brain damage. The deposition continued for 6 grueling hours. Vance took Miller through every one of his 31 prior citizen complaints. Each time, Miller's answer was the same. The citizen was lying. They were uncooperative. He had followed procedure. He showed no remorse, no self-reflection, no acknowledgement that he could have possibly handled any of those situations differently. His arrogance was a shield, and he held it up against every question. But Vance knew that what looked like a shield to Miller would look like pure, unadulterated hubris to a jury. He was not a sympathetic character. He was a bully who had finally been called to account for his actions and couldn't fathom that he had done anything wrong. By the end of the day, Miller's confident facade had cracked. He was visibly angry, his answers becoming shorter and more hostile. He had walked into the room expecting to control the narrative, just as he had in the park. Instead, Eleanor Vance had meticulously dissected his every action, his every decision, and his every excuse, laying his arrogance bare on the official court record. The deposition transcript, running over 300 pages, was no longer just a record of questions and answers. It was a portrait of a man who believed his badge made him infallible. It was a portrait Vance couldn't wait to show the jury. With discovery complete, the city's legal team made a final desperate attempt to avoid a public trial. They filed a motion for summary judgment, a legal maneuver asking the judge to dismiss the case entirely. Their argument was a masterclass in legal gymnastics. They claimed that Officer Miller was protected by qualified immunity, a controversial legal doctrine that shields government officials from liability unless they have violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. The city's lawyers argued that there was no specific law, no previous court ruling, that clearly established a first responder's right to be free from arrest while performing their duties. Therefore, Miller could not have known he was violating the law. They further argued that Jamal's refusal to obey a direct order constituted probable cause for the obstruction charge, making the arrest itself lawful, regardless of the context. The motion was a cynical bet that the judge would see the incident through the narrowest possible legal lens, ignoring the glaring reality of the situation in favor of procedural technicalities. Eleanor Vance's response was a blistering 50-page legal brief that systematically dismantled their arguments. She argued that qualified immunity was not intended to protect an officer who recklessly interferes with life-saving medical care in direct violation of state law and departmental policy. She cited the state statute that made interference with emergency medical personnel a felony, arguing that this was, in fact, a clearly established right. To suggest that Officer Miller could not have known that pulling a paramedic away from a dying man was wrong, she wrote, is an insult to the intelligence of the court and the conscience of the community. She attached excerpts from Miller's deposition, highlighting his admission that the conflict was about establishing control, not investigating a crime. She included a sworn affidavit from the department's own training commander, who, under deposition, had been forced to admit that St. Corbin police recruits are explicitly taught to defer to EMS personnel at medical scenes. The hearing on the motion was held in Judge Sandoval's courtroom. It was a formal, quiet affair, devoid of the drama of a trial. Only the lawyers were present, along with Jamal and David Henderson, who sat together in the gallery. The city's attorney, Marcus Thorne, presented his case first, his arguments dry and technical, focusing on legal precedents and case law. He tried to paint Miller as an officer making a split-second decision in a confusing environment. Then, it was Eleanor Vance's turn. She stood before the judge, her presence commanding the room. She didn't just argue legal theory. She told a story. "Your Honor," she began, "this is not a case about complex legal doctrines. It is about a simple, fundamental duty, the duty of a paramedic to his patient, and it is about the catastrophic consequences that occur when a police officer decides his authority is more important than that duty. She then turned to the large screen she had set up in the courtroom. Before I proceed with my oral arguments, I would ask the court's permission to play one piece of evidence, Exhibit A, the unedited body camera footage from Officer Miller's device. Thorne immediately stood up. Objection, Your Honor. This is a hearing on legal matters, not a trial. The footage is inflammatory and irrelevant to the question of qualified immunity. Judge Sandoval looked down from her bench, her expression unreadable. Mr. Thorne, the court is perfectly capable of distinguishing between inflammatory evidence and relevant facts. I'll allow it. Proceed, Ms. Vance. For the next 10 minutes, the courtroom was silent except for the audio from the video. Judge Sandoval watched the screen without blinking, her face a stony mask. She saw the initial command. She saw Jamal's gesture. She heard Liam's plea. She heard Miller say, "I don't care what he's doing." She saw him pull Jamal away. She saw the chaos that ensued. When the video ended, a heavy silence hung in the room. Vance let the silence linger for a moment before speaking. The city asks this court to rule that Officer Miller's actions were reasonable, that it was reasonable to interrupt CPR, that it was reasonable to arrest a paramedic for saving a life. They ask you to find that no clearly established right was violated. Your Honor, the most clearly established right of all is the right to life. And on that day, Officer Miller decided he had the authority to put that right in jeopardy for the sake of his own ego. Judge Sandoval looked from Vance to Thorne. She didn't need to hear any more. "I have reviewed the motions and the evidence presented," she said, her voice sharp and decisive. "The doctrine of qualified immunity is not an impenetrable shield for reckless behavior. Any reasonable officer would know that their actions in this situation were unlawful. The motion for summary judgment is denied. This case will be heard by a jury of Mr. Fisher's peers. We will proceed to trial in 6 weeks." A quiet gasp came from David Henderson. Jamal reached over and put a hand on his shoulder. It was a monumental victory. The city's last line of defense had crumbled. There would be no backroom deal, no dismissal on a technicality. The unblinking eye of the body camera had not only convinced the judge, but it had also guaranteed that the full story would now be told in open court, where the whole world could watch. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled with reporters, members of the public, and a contingent of off-duty paramedics who had come to support Jamal. The air buzzed with anticipation. After months of legal battles, the case of Fisher and Henderson versus Miller and Street, Corbin was finally beginning. Jamal sat at the plaintiff's table beside Eleanor Vance, dressed in a conservative suit, looking more like a young college professor than a paramedic. Across the aisle, Officer Nathan Miller sat with his legal team, his face an impassive mask, but a muscle in his jaw twitched uncontrollably. After the jury was seated, a diverse group of 7 women and 5 men, Eleanor Vance rose to give her opening statement. She walked slowly toward the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. She didn't raise her voice. She simply told the story. She spoke of a paramedic's oath, of the sacred rhythm of CPR, and of a dying man named Arthur Henderson. Then she told them about a police officer who arrived on the scene and saw not a medical crisis, but a challenge to his authority. "This case," she concluded, her voice ringing with quiet conviction, "is about what happens when a public servant with a badge and a gun forgets that his first duty is to protect life, not to command obedience." The defense's opening statement was a stark contrast. The city's lead attorney portrayed Officer Miller as a dedicated public servant forced to make a difficult decision on a chaotic scene. He painted Jamal as an uncooperative and insubordinate individual whose refusal to follow orders created a safety risk. He told the jury that this was a case about a paramedic who thought the rules didn't apply to him. Then Vance called her first witness. The plaintiff calls Dr. Angela Roman to the stand. A woman in her 50s with a kind, serious face walked to the witness stand. She was the chief of emergency medicine at St. Corbin Memorial Hospital, the doctor who had been on duty when Arthur Henderson was brought in. Vance led her through her credentials: Harvard Medical School, 25 years of experience in emergency and trauma medicine. She was an unimpeachable expert. Dr. Roman, Vance began, can you please describe Mr. Henderson's condition upon his arrival at your hospital? Dr. Roman looked at the jury. Mr. Henderson was in extremis. He was comatose, unresponsive, and his heart was in a state of ventricular fibrillation. To put it in layman's terms, he was clinically dead. We were just managing to keep his body alive with machines and medication. Vance continued, and you were eventually able to restart his heart and stabilize him. Is that correct? Yes, after a prolonged resuscitation effort, we were able to restore a stable cardiac rhythm. Doctor, in your professional opinion, what caused Mr. Henderson's comatose state? He suffered a profound anoxic brain injury. Dr. Roman explained, her voice clear and precise. It was caused by a significant period of oxygen deprivation to the brain. Vance paused, letting the words sink in before asking the crucial question. Based on your review of the paramedics' reports, the ambulance logs, and the body camera footage, do you have an opinion as to when this brain injury occurred? The city's attorney shot to his feet. Objection! Calls for speculation. Overruled, Judge Sandoval said immediately. The witness is an expert. She may answer. Doctor. Roman adjusted her glasses. Yes, I have an opinion. The initial cardiac arrest would have started the process of oxygen deprivation. However, the first paramedics on the scene began high-quality CPR almost immediately. According to all accepted medical standards, this would have provided sufficient blood flow to the brain to prevent severe, widespread cellular death. She paused, then looked directly at the jury. The catastrophic damage occurred during the period where CPR was halted. According to the timeline, there was a gap of nearly 4 minutes between when paramedic Fisher was removed from the patient and when the second EMS crew was able to resume effective, deep compressions. In cases of cardiac arrest, every second counts. 4 minutes without adequate blood flow to the brain is an eternity. It is, in my professional opinion, the single event that directly led to the severity of Mr. Henderson's permanent brain damage. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Vance had just drawn a direct, unbroken line from Officer Miller's actions to the devastating medical outcome. She wasn't just arguing that the arrest was wrong. She was arguing that it was tantamount to a physical assault on Arthur Henderson. So, to be perfectly clear, Dr. Vance said, her voice steady, if the CPR had not been interrupted, is it your medical opinion that Mr. Henderson would have had a significantly better chance of a full neurological recovery? Objection! The defense attorney shouted. Overruled, the judge said. Doctor. Roman's answer was quiet, but firm. Yes, without question. Vance looked at the jury, then at Officer Miller. No further questions. Your Honor. The first day of the trial was over, and the defense was already bleeding. The testimony of one doctor had transformed the case from a question of procedure into a question of life and death. On the second day of the trial, Eleanor Vance called her next witness. The plaintiff calls Jamal Fisher to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom as Jamal walked from the plaintiff's table to the witness box. He moved with a quiet confidence, his posture straight, his gaze steady. He wore the same simple dark suit, a stark contrast to the paramedic's uniform the jury had seen him wearing in the viral videos. For the first hour, Vance led him through his background and training. She had him explain to the jury what it meant to be a paramedic, the years of schooling, the constant recertification, the high-stakes nature of the job. He spoke calmly and clearly, explaining complex medical concepts in simple, accessible terms. He described his passion for the work, the feeling of being able to help people on the worst day of their lives. He was not just a victim, he was a dedicated professional. Then Vance shifted to the day of the incident. Mr. Fisher, can you describe for the jury what is happening in a person's body during cardiac arrest? The heart has stopped pumping blood effectively, Jamal explained. The brain, the lungs, the organs, they are all being starved of oxygen. From the moment the heart stops, the clock is ticking. Within 4 to 6 minutes without blood flow, brain cells begin to die. That's why we start chest compressions immediately. We are manually pumping the heart for the patient, forcing blood to the brain to keep it alive until we can fix the underlying problem. So, when you are performing CPR, what is your primary focus? Vance asked. The rhythm, Jamal said without hesitation. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, a depth of at least 2 inches, a rate of 100 to 120 compressions per minute. You cannot break that rhythm. Breaking the rhythm means the blood pressure drops to 0. It means the brain is being starved again. The rhythm is everything. Vance walked him through the events in the park. He recounted the story in the same factual, unemotional tone he used for his medical reports. He described arriving, assessing the patient, starting CPR. He described hearing Officer Miller's voice. Why didn't you stop and answer him? Vance asked. Because my patient was dying, Jamal said simply. My training, my duty, and every ethical guideline in my profession dictated that I could not stop. To stop would be to abandon my patient. So, you made a choice? I upheld my oath. Jamal corrected her. There was no other choice to make. Then, Vance played the body camera footage again, this time for Jamal to narrate. The courtroom watched in rapt attention as the events unfolded on the large screen, this time with the perspective of the man at the center of it all. Pause the video there, Vance said. At the moment, Miller grabbed Jamal's shoulder. Mr. Fisher, what were you thinking at this exact moment? Jamal looked at the frozen image on the screen. I was thinking that a hand on my shoulder was preventing me from keeping my hands on my patient's chest. I was thinking that every second this officer was touching me was a second Mr. Henderson was closer to brain death. The cross-examination by the city's attorney was aggressive. He tried to paint Jamal as an arrogant hothead, someone with a grudge against police who deliberately chose to be insubordinate. Mr. Fisher, you admit you heard a direct, lawful order from a police officer, did you not? I heard a man telling me to stop saving another man's life. I don't consider that a lawful order. So you, a paramedic, believe you have the authority to decide which laws to follow and which to ignore? The attorney pressed. I believe I have a legal and moral duty to provide care to my patient. State law protects that duty from interference. The attorney tried to trip him up, to make him angry. But Jamal remained calm. His answers were direct, respectful, and always circled back to the same unassailable point, his patient's welfare. After an hour of fruitless attacks, the city's attorney sat down, visibly frustrated. Jamal had not taken the bait. He had presented himself exactly as he was, a competent, composed professional who had been forced into an impossible situation. His testimony had a powerful effect on the jury. They had seen the video. They had heard the doctor. And now they had heard from the man himself. They saw his quiet dedication, his unwavering commitment to his patient. He was not the insubordinate rogue the city wanted them to see. He was a hero, not because of any dramatic single act of bravery, but because in a moment of extreme pressure, when faced with an aggressive, armed man demanding he abandon his duty, he had simply, quietly, and courageously refused to stop doing his job. The trial lasted 7 days. The jury heard from Liam, who corroborated every detail of Jamal's testimony, his voice thick with anger as he described Miller's actions. They heard from Sarah, the paramedic from the second ambulance, who described the patient's dire condition upon her arrival. They even heard from 2 of the bystanders who had filmed the incident, their testimony painting a picture of universal shock and disbelief at the officer's conduct. The defense, in turn, put Officer Miller on the stand. It was a disaster. Under direct examination from his own lawyer, he was confident, sticking to his story about needing to secure the scene. But under a blistering cross-examination from Eleanor Vance, he fell apart. She confronted him with his deposition, his contradictory statements, and his long history of citizen complaints. He became defensive, argumentative, and petulant. He repeatedly claimed he was the real victim, targeted by a paramedic with an attitude problem. The jury stared at him, their faces cold and impassive. He was not a sympathetic figure. He was the embodiment of the arrogance they had heard so much about. Finally, the time came for closing arguments. The city's attorney went first, making a final plea to the jury to see the world through the eyes of a police officer. He argued that the city couldn't afford to second-guess its officers and that a verdict against Miller would hamstring law enforcement. Then, Eleanor Vance rose and walked to the center of the courtroom. She stood in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle. "For 7 days," she began, her voice quiet but resonant. "We have talked about laws and protocols and procedures, but this case is not about a rule book. It is about a choice. The choice Officer Nathan Miller made when he valued his own authority more than Arthur Henderson's life." She reminded them of Dr. Roman's testimony. A 4-minute gap, 4 minutes. That's how long it takes to listen to a song on the radio. It's how long it takes to wait for a red light. And it is how long it took for Arthur Henderson's future to be stolen from him. A future that now consists of the 4 walls of a hospital room. She then turned her attention to the city's role. The defense wants you to believe this was a one-time mistake by an otherwise good officer. But we have shown you that is not true. We showed you 31 prior complaints. We showed you a pattern of aggression and abuse that the city of St. Corbin knew about and that they chose to ignore, time and time again. They are not just responsible, they are complicit. They left a ticking time bomb on their police force, and on that day in Liberty Park, it finally exploded. Her voice began to rise, filled with a righteous passion. Jamal Fisher is a hero, not because he ran into a burning building, but because he did something much harder. He stood his ground, armed with nothing but his training and his conscience, and he refused to be bullied into abandoning his patient. He did his job. And for that, he was arrested. For that, Arthur Henderson was condemned. She walked toward the jury box, her eyes sweeping across their faces. Your verdict in this case will do more than decide how much money to award. Your verdict will send a message. It will tell the St. Corbin Police Department that this kind of conduct is unacceptable. It will tell paramedics, EMTs, and nurses everywhere that the law will protect them when they protect their patients. It will establish a new rhythm, a rhythm of accountability. She paused, then delivered her final charge. The defense asks you to protect the police. I ask you to do something more important. I ask you to protect the public from police officers like Nathan Miller. I ask you to deliver justice for Jamal Fisher. And I ask you, on behalf of a man who can no longer ask for himself, to deliver justice for Arthur Henderson. She walked back to her table and sat down. The courtroom was utterly still. The case was now in the hands of the jury. All the evidence had been presented. All the arguments made. All that was left was to wait for their answer. The wait was agonizing. An hour passed. Then 2. The jury remained behind the closed door of the deliberation room, their silence amplifying the tension in the courthouse. Jamal, Liam, Eleanor Vance, and the Henderson family sat in the nearly empty courtroom, making small talk, trying to distract from the crushing weight of the unknown. Every time the courtroom door opened, every head would snap up, only to see a clerk or a bailiff go about their business. Jamal stared at the empty jury box, the 12 chairs that held the fate of his future and the meaning of his ordeal. Had he done enough? Had he explained it clearly? Would they see the truth through the fog of legal arguments and procedural defenses? He felt a hand on his arm and looked over to see Carol Henderson, Arthur's wife. She gave him a small, weary smile. "Whatever happens, Jamal," she whispered, "you fought for him. You were the only one who fought for him that day. My family will never forget that." Her words were a balm on his frayed nerves. He knew, in that moment, that regardless of the verdict, he had made the right choice. After 4.5 hours, the bailiff entered the courtroom. "We have a verdict," he announced, his voice booming in the quiet room. A current of electricity shot through the air. Reporters scrambled back to their seats. The lawyers straightened their ties. Miller and his team filed back in, their faces grim. Jamal took a deep breath, his heart pounding against his ribs. The jury filed back into the box. They moved with a solemn purpose, their faces unreadable. They refused to make eye contact with either the plaintiff's or the defendant's table, a classic sign that made predicting the outcome impossible. The jury forewoman, a middle-aged school teacher, handed a slip of paper to the bailiff, who in turn handed it to Judge Sandoval. The judge unfolded it, her eyes scanning the contents. Her expression did not change. She handed it back to the forewoman. "Madam Forewoman," the judge said, "in the matter of Fisher and Henderson versus Miller and the city of St. Corbin, has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, we have, Your Honor," the forewoman said, her voice clear and steady. "On the charge of unlawful arrest against Officer Miller, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff, Jamal Fisher." A quiet gasp went through the courtroom. Jamal felt Eleanor Vance's hand squeeze his arm. "On the charge of violation of civil rights against Officer Miller, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff, Jamal Fisher, on the charge of battery against Arthur Henderson, committed by Officer Miller, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff, the estate of Arthur Henderson. And on the final charge, that the city of St. Corbin was negligent in its failure to properly train and supervise Officer Miller, leading to these events. How do you find?" "We find for the plaintiffs." It was a clean sweep, a total victory. But the most stunning part was yet to come. The forewoman cleared her throat and began to read the damages the jury had decided to award. "For the unlawful arrest and violation of Jamal Fisher's civil rights, we award compensatory and punitive damages in the amount of $5 million. The room erupted in murmurs. $5 million was a staggering sum, a clear punishment for Miller's actions. But the forewoman wasn't finished. "For the battery negligence and the resulting injuries and lifetime care required for Mr. Arthur Henderson, we award compensatory and punitive damages in the amount of $20 million. For a moment, there was complete, stunned silence. Then the room exploded. $20 million. Combined with Jamal's award, The total verdict was $25 million. It was a historic, record-shattering amount. It was more than just a verdict. It was a judgment. It was a seismic event that sent a shockwave not just through the city of St. Corbin, but through every municipality and police department in the country. Jamal sat frozen, the number echoing in his head. It wasn't about the money, but the number was the message. It was the jury's way of quantifying the scale of the injustice. It was their answer to the city's arrogance, to Miller's cruelty, to Arthur Henderson's stolen life. David Henderson broke down, sobbing quietly into his hands. His mother, Carol, wrapped her arms around him, tears streaming down her own face. They were tears of grief, but also of vindication. Across the aisle, Nathan Miller stared blankly ahead, his face ashen. His career, his reputation, his entire world had just been demolished by 12 ordinary citizens who had listened to the evidence and delivered their undeniable answer. The city had been warned. The jury had made them pay. The verdict was more than an ending. It was a beginning. The $25 million judgment was a thunderclap that forced immediate and sweeping change. Within a week, Nathan Miller was fired from the St. Corbin Police Department, the city, facing immense public pressure and the threat of further lawsuits, did not appeal the verdict. They paid the judgment and began the painful process of reform. The mayor announced the formation of a new civilian oversight board with the power to independently investigate police misconduct. The police chief, who had defended Miller throughout the ordeal, was forced into early retirement. His replacement, a reform-minded deputy chief from another city, immediately commissioned a top-to-bottom review of the department's use of force policies and, most critically, its protocols for interacting with other first responders. The Jamal Fisher Rule, as it became known unofficially within the department, was implemented within 6 months. It was a new, explicit directive. At any active medical emergency, EMS personnel have command of the patient. Law enforcement's role was to be supportive, securing the scene from genuine threats, directing traffic, and assisting only when requested by the medical lead. Any officer found to be interfering with active medical care would face immediate suspension and an automatic internal affairs investigation. But the legacy of the case extended far beyond the city limits of St. Corbin. Eleanor Vance, using the momentum from the victory, partnered with the National Paramedics Union to draft model legislation called the First Responders Shield Law. It made interfering with an on-duty emergency medical worker a serious felony and stripped away qualified immunity as a defense in civil suits for any officer who did so. The story of Jamal Fisher and Arthur Henderson became the centerpiece of their lobbying efforts. They showed the body camera footage in state houses across the country. They brought in medical experts to explain the life-or-death importance of uninterrupted care. Jamal, who had never sought the spotlight, found himself a reluctant but powerful advocate. He testified before legislative committees, not as a victim, but as a professional explaining the realities of his job. He didn't speak with anger. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who had lived through the worst-case scenario. His testimony was devastatingly effective. Within 2 years, 12 states had passed versions of the Shield Law. A significant portion of the settlement money was used to establish the Henderson-Fisher Foundation for First Responder Advocacy. The foundation provided legal support for paramedics, EMTs, and firefighters who faced retaliation or wrongful arrest for prioritizing patient care. It also funded new cross-disciplinary training programs, bringing police recruits and paramedic trainees into the same classroom to run through complex scenarios, teaching communication and mutual respect from the very beginning of their careers. The body camera footage of Jamal's arrest became a standard training tool in both police and paramedic academies nationwide. a powerful, real-world example of what not to do. Jamal eventually returned to work. It was a difficult decision, but he knew that being a paramedic was not just his job. It was who he was. Things were different now. He was treated with a new level of respect at scenes. Police officers, many of whom had followed his case, were more deferential, more aware of the boundaries. His quiet act of defiance in the park had redrawn the lines for everyone. He continued to visit Arthur Henderson in the long-term care facility. The man remained in a coma. His body kept alive by machines, a silent, constant reminder of the stakes of that day. Sitting by his bedside, Jamal would feel not guilt, but a renewed sense of purpose. The fight had been for him, and the legacy it created would protect countless others. It wasn't the justice they had wanted, but it was the justice they had achieved, a legacy of change, forged in the fire of a single, catastrophic moment. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was profound. In the quiet moments, long after the trial was a memory and the reforms were just standard procedure, one could still wonder about the origin of the lightning. What turns a man with a duty to protect into an agent of harm? Perhaps Nathan Miller's time as a military police officer had ingrained in him a rigid worldview where orders were absolute, and questioning them was a threat to the entire structure of command. In the civilian world, a world of nuance and competing duties, that rigidity became a fatal flaw. He saw a paramedic's intense focus not as professionalism, but as insubordination. He saw a nonverbal gesture to wait not as communication, but as disrespect. He couldn't adapt his definition of control to fit a situation where he wasn't, and shouldn't have been, the ultimate authority. What if there had been an early intervention system that actually worked? If the 31 complaints had triggered mandatory counseling or de-escalation retraining instead of being swept under the rug, perhaps Miller would have learned to pause, to assess, to listen before acting. For Jamal, the questions were different. If the law had already been clear, would Miller have hesitated? If interagency training had been the norm, would he have understood Jamal's role from the start? These are the questions that drive progress, the what-ifs that build better systems to protect us from the friction points of human fallibility. The story teaches us that true authority is not demanded at the end of a gun or with the power of a badge, but earned through respect, competence, and an unwavering commitment to the preservation of life. Professionalism is not silent obedience. Sometimes, it is the courage to say no to a wrongful command, to say yes to a higher duty. This story is a testament to the quiet heroes who do the right thing when no one is watching, and even when the ones watching are trying to stop them. Have you ever had to stand up for what you knew was right, even when it was the harder path to take? What do you believe is the most important quality for someone in a position of authority? Let us know in the comments below. And please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.